And of course, for those who have been with us all day, we started in Asia this early morning, moved on to the Middle East, Europe, and now wrapping up the forum in the Americas. So we appreciate you staying on board. The critical question that we're addressing on today's panel is what will be the top 3 priorities of Biden's geopolitical energy strategy in 2023? And I'm excited to invite our special guest speakers, Rachel Ziemba, founder of Ziemba Insights, Dr. Ahmoud Shokri, energy strategist and author of U.S. Energy Diplomacy in the Caspian Sea Basin, Changing Trends Since 2001, and Dr. Omar Ubaidli, Director of Research at Darasat Bahrain. Thank you all for joining the session. We appreciate it. Rachel, I'd like to first kick off with you on your opening comments. Obviously, there's been a lot going on in the U.S. recently, but essentially your comments on the top 3 priorities of Biden's energy strategy for 2023.
Sure. So I think all of the top priorities energy-wise are really linked into the top geopolitical strategies overall. And that really means the US right now, foreign policy apparatus, very much focused on trying to bring Russia's war, Russia's attack of Ukraine to an end. And so that means using a lot of tools in the energy space that really were not on the table some years ago. First off, of course, the oil sort of price cap. That's something I know other speakers today have spoken about in length. This goal of redirecting Russian oil and gas and cutting their revenues. The balancing act there from the United States is really trying to reroute to avoid major shocks in oil output. But that's going to be a difficult balancing act, particularly if Chinese demand picks up later in the year. And we can talk about that. But that sort of priority number 1 is really trying to cut Russian revenues, but not cut and leave global consumers without fuel. And of course, they're more concerned about US consumers than they are about global ones, but they are worried about the global economy. And so as a result, we're also going to see continued adjustments of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And that, of course, is going to bring them into conflict. And there are mixed views with the OPEC countries, not only because of those OPEC countries' relationships with Russia within OPEC Plus, which I'm sure we'll talk more about, but also because we're really seeing in a different way in this year, the U.S. involved on many sides of the oil trade, not only in working with the G7 to control and really try to reshape Russian supplies, but also to use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as a tool on the market. I hope that we're going to see, and I hope we're going to have a good debate on this, I'm sure, that we're going to see a more technocratic conversation with OPEC rather than politicizing and really looking at it. The challenge, I think, though, is there are very different economic baselines that most of the OPEC members have versus what the Americans have about what the global economy can bear and what the economic interests are there. And I know you said only 3, but I'm going to slot in one more, which is trying to manage and deal with sort of trying to add some additional supplies here and there, and particularly watching Venezuela. I'm not too optimistic about rapprochement beyond small amounts being added. I know other panelists in this great discussion have talked about that earlier in the day, so I won't belabor it. But I think this element of replacing supplies, keeping supplies flowing is, of course, made more complicated by the fact that nuclear diplomacy with Iran is at a standstill. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of new supplies coming from Iran. I don't think there's going to be a lot of losses either. But this issue of that we're coming to bear of how we're dealing with a significant shift in how oil and gas is moving around the world, particularly via sort of more government interventions. So And I think I'm waiting to see whether on some of the structural issues, relationships between Asia and the Middle East, whether the US stops being as reactive and starts to sort of really communicate what the sort of energy mix is going to look like, because this is going to stay an administration that is not only, worried about oil and gas supplies, but is still really trying to push for energy transition goals. And so I know there's been a big wake-up call this year about oil and gas, and some more articulation about that world looks like. But I'm hoping that it'll be sort of a U.S. government that's more willing to talk about the energy sector in realistic terms in that way. And we'll see how the new Congress fits in. There's a lot of issues there. Now I'm going to stop there. I can't wait to hear what the other panelists have to say about their priorities.
Dr. Mahmood, obviously a lot to unpack there. A lot going on with the U.S. Just want to get your opening comments on there. Of course, we touched on the changing dynamics of oil and gas flows. What is your outlook for 2023 on Biden's agenda?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And by the last year and after the spread of COVID, and especially after the Russia invasion of Ukraine, majority of countries in the world concentrated just on energy security rather than energy transition process. And referring to your question, I think that as my colleague said that in his initial remark, Biden trying to create a balance in the market, and the first in domestic market. Energy security in the U.S. equals that gas price and pump station, and when Biden came to power, so that the oil price goes up, and especially is tricking the U.S. economy, and we saw that the high inflation rate during the last 4 decades, and Biden reached sometimes to OPEC plus, mainly Russia, UAE, and Saudi Arabia and UAE to pump more oil in the market to create the balance. The price goes down, but OPEC plus just focused on their own national interest and just follow the policy that with the best for gain more geopolitical gain in the market. But in due to this regard, as you know, before he came to power, in the presidential campaign focused just energy transition and the increase of the renewable energy in the U.S. Electricity and U.S. Energy basket. I think in 2023, Biden tried at the same time focus on energy transition, more investment in the energy infrastructure, and also trying to, I think it is better for the U.S. and the Saudi Arabia to open new chapter in bilateral relation. Without the cooperation between Saudi, it will be very hard for the U.S. and other energy consumers to buy cheap energy from the market, mainly oil. And as you know, last Friday, Qatar Energy and Chevron signed a new deal to build the Middle East largest petrochemical facility in the Qatar, and also by the last November, Qatar and the US also signed a new deal to invest in Texas, and by the last October, also US and the Qatar signed a new deal to Qatar is interested to buy renewable energy procedure in the US. I think energy transition in the next decade is the best chance for the US and GCC, and also energy security to boost their relation, and GCC will be able to supply more financial capability to the US energy project, and us energy firm will be able to supply more technology in the energy transition process. We need high financial capability and high technology, and both sides some capacity to help each other plan. And as I mentioned, without the cooperation between GCC, it will be hard for the US, and we have by next year, 2024, the new presidential election. And if Biden will not be able to success to reduce the inflation rate and to reduce the gas price in the pump station and generally in the gas and electricity price, it will be very hard for the Democrats in the next presidential election. And I think it is better to stop initial remark, and we'll discuss in detail in the rest of our panel.
Dr. Omar, I just want to bring you in on that as well. Of course, looking at the region, going back and forth between the U.S. And of course, where you're based, Bahrain. Obviously, there's been tension between the U.S. and OPEC Plus over the past year. That's going to be a prominent theme again, I imagine, in 2023, especially looking at the economic outlook globally. Forecasts are downward for everyone outside, it seems, the GCC at the moment. What's your outlook for the Biden agenda in terms of energy for the year ahead?
Well, while I agree with most of what Rachel and Dr. Ahmoud said, I do have a slight difference with them regarding US policy towards OPEC Plus. I think that the US's position regarding OPEC Plus is highly affected by dysfunctional domestic politics in the US. And is not actually a rational position that reflects US interests. It reflects sort of a very narrow and transient set of Democrat interests rather than general interests of the US. The goal of OPEC Plus is to maintain price stability for the benefit of producers, obviously, but as it happens, for the benefit of consumers too. If something like what the US is supposedly calling for, which is a free-for-all, were to happen, then you would get very high amplitude price cycles because of the nature of the investment cycle in oil, which would be incredibly damaging to both importers, including the
When you
US
say
allies.
free for all, what do you mean by that, by the way?
As in no coordination, no coordinated output cuts or expansions. If every country behaves totally unilaterally,
right,
which is supposedly what the US is angling for. I think that would be very damaging to all economies, both producers and consumers. And that's what OPEC Plus believes. And that's what OPEC Plus repeats ad nauseum. But as I say, due to some very narrow and transient interests for the Democrat Party, it's being turned into something. The reality is that things like the inflation that the US is facing and many of its own domestic energy problems are the result of poor policy choices by the Democrats and previously the Republicans. But you know as well as I do that domestic politicians are always quite happy to look for an external party to lay the blame at. And as it happens, OPEC Plus is a frequent, source of, or I should say, willing recipient of that ire. But in terms of what we're going to see going forwards, now that at least we're past the uncertainty of the midterm elections, I expect that what we'll find is that there will be some more tension in the relationship, but not as much as it was leading up to the elections because the stakes are not so high. And secondly, I think that OPEC Plus has actually gained some credibility in the general, in the general market because of its, it made the right call regarding cutting output, which caused so much consternation because they actually predicted what was going to happen pretty well. And I think what you'll find is that as Chinese demand starts putting upward pressure on prices, OPEC Plus will respond by increasing output and help put downward pressure on prices, which will confirm what OPEC Plus has been saying along, which is that we want price stability. This is not just some sort of 19th century cartel.
So where does current U.S. oil production fit into that equation, right? I think I just read a stat earlier that 2022 was the second highest on record for oil production in the U.S. We're looking at the next 2 years. It's expected to have probably the most growth in terms of oil production. How does that fit into the equation?
Right. So, part of the reason for the aforementioned dysfunction in U.S. energy policy is that it's sort of split between being an oil importer and an oil exporter. It doesn't even have sort of schizophrenic relationship with oil markets. I think that as credit has become much more expensive, with interest rates being so high, the shale oil producers in the US have had a much harder time responding to markets than they did, say, circa 2018, 2017. I think they will respond obviously positively to the increasing prices, and they will increase their production, and that will be in general beneficial for the US economy. But I think that at the end of the day, they're not the central part of the foreign policy and energy equation at the moment because of what Rachel mentioned, which is that the centerpiece is currently what's going on in Ukraine. And it's like all hands on deck for dealing with Ukraine. So I think that what you'll see is US energy producers happily, making higher profits, but being marginalized in terms of the foreign policy equation and the focus being on But unfortunately, the US has got itself in a bit of a pickle because, as Rachel and Dr. Wood mentioned, prices are going to be potentially going up, but at the same time, that it's trying to undermine Russia's economic potential, and it potentially wanted Iran to increase its production, but it's not handled the negotiations well. So it's really sort of it's a bit of a hash, and they're kind of thrashing around somewhat aimlessly, and I don't think it's going well for the Americans, and I expect that to continue.
I just want to bring you in on that, of course, as you mentioned, a key aspect, Ukraine-Russia war. How do you see the U.S. role in the current conflict playing out in 2023? Of course, you mentioned earlier, you have a Republican-led House controlling some of the purse strings at the moment. What is your outlook in that aspect?
Sure, and I think we're dealing with the Republican-led House that I obviously there's big questions ahead about things like the debt ceiling, question marks about whether there actually will be cuts to defense spending and the like. I'm a little skeptical. I mean, my view still is that the U.S. is still going to provide financial support to Ukraine, particularly on the military side. I think that budgetary support, the kind of thing that, if anything, Ukraine probably needs more, will be harder. But that's not been particularly easy in the U.S. or other contexts. I think we are starting to see something that's going to have big ramifications, which is seizure and forfeiture of assets, Russian assets. And that's a whole other conversation that maybe would be interesting to talk about, particularly as it might pertain to energy and resource assets. But I'll park that. We only have a few minutes together today. But I think it's another one of these examples of new tools being wielded that can reshape global markets. I think, Omar and Umud have sort of raised really interesting sort of points here. I agree with Omar that the U.S. energy policy from Washington has been very reactive. And that was the case before the war in Russia's invasion. But it became clearer after the fact. This is an administration that came in with an energy transition agenda, one that it's not only in the U.S., Europe and a number of other sort of developed economies also are on this agenda. The problem was it wasn't reflective of what the consumption patterns were today. And so it sent a message on investment and the like. That being said, I think that we are seeing the U.S. also in a very different world about industrial policy relating to supply chains. I think a lot of these are more medium-term trends. Overall, I do think that this is going to be, this has been a year of wake-up call for the administration about the importance of actually understanding the nuts and bolts of how the global energy market works. And the only reason I'm optimistic that maybe we'll see a little less politicization of some of these issues outside of Russia is a recognition of where some of the plumbing issues in the global energy markets are. I disagree that the agenda is just sort of a fringe democratic one. I think that if anything, there is a bipartisan concern about OPEC. I don't think things like NOPEC are going to go anywhere legislatively. But I do think there is an area of both parties that has a bit of a sort of nationalistic, isolationist, industrial policy sort of element. So I think we'll continue to see some noise, maybe not as much as the midterms, but some noise about things like export bans and the like, worries about LNG costs going up. But at the end of the day, I think we have to come back to the fact that certain U.S. regions are importers and certain are exporters. And Washington, if anything, is more focused on the regions that are importers rather than necessarily the regions that are exporters. And so that is going to be a factor. The slowdown in the U.S. and global economy, paradoxically, it may help that sort of cool down those sort of political tensions a bit as well. It's never the way I would want to have a cooling of anything because the risk is it goes too far. But I do think 2023 is going to be that's going to play out. I'm going to stop talking and hear from the rest of the panelists.
I just wanted to follow up to that, though. You mentioned,
please,
in terms of a reactive approach. What's a low-hanging fruit for 2023 that you would consider proactive from the administration? that could be laid out at the moment?
Sure. I mean, I think that the ways that the administration is trying to use the other side of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, refilling it, trying to, in some ways, actually create a bit of a floor as well as a ceiling. I mean, it might be a different floor and ceiling than OPEC is focused towards, but I think trying to avoid, for example, selling and buying at the same time, that congressional rules, that's something I'm watching for. I'm watching for, but not super optimistic on whether there'll be new permitting reform, something that didn't happen in the last Congress, something that there is hopefully enough bipartisan support for. The permitting reform, maybe not low-hanging fruit, but I think it's something that sends an important message along with this setting a floor of guidance to the US and global energy investors about the prospects. And I even think that sort of clarity on environmental regulations is really important because I do think one trend we're going to see across the global economy is a focus on full life cycle emissions of different fossil fuel and other energy sources. We see some other producers, including those in the Gulf, getting ahead of the game and sort of framing that. But I think that that's going to come into play. Maybe it's more of a 2024 and beyond story, but I think it's going to be something we see there.
I do want to come back to that aspect, but Dr. Ahmoud, I'd like to bring you in as well, getting your insights in terms of course, the Russia-Ukraine situation, how you think that will impact U.S. energy policy in 2023.
Yeah, before the beginning of the new year, and the majority of energy experts and foreign policy advisors believe that we have the three factors that will affect the global energy market and maybe the change the current energy dynamics in the 2023. And one of them was Putin himself and Putin's decision toward the continue or the ending the Ukraine war. And it's really that West, especially US, wants to give more weapon and from the financial aspects supporting Ukraine, and but the continuing the Korean war is not in favor of the consumer side, such as EU and the US as well. If Putin wants to continue current war, it's against the Russia economic and energy and national security, as you know, by the last February and after the beginning of the war, and the US and EU tried to impose new sanctions against the Russia energy sector. Energy export is the main source of revenue for the Russia economy, and we can see the gradually decrease of the Russia revenue. If this year war continue, we can see the huge decrease in Russia revenue, and maybe we have seen some unrest in the Russia due to the bad economic situation. And referring to your question, I think that at present, the US just trying to continue supporting EU, just trying to supporting Ukraine, and also trying to impose sanctions and trying to tighten the selling of the Russian oil and gas in the gray market. As you know, by the last December and after the Russia oil price cap, Russia trying to use selling cheap oil to China, India, and Turkey as well. And Russia will be able to keep some part of its stake in the market, but Russia has to sell with the huge discount. And I think yesterday I checked some statistics, but according to some energy think tank and energy website, they mentioned that Russia at present selling its oil less than $40 per barrel, and I think with the huge cost of the production of barrel, it's not in the favor of the Russia economic and energy and national security. And without solving the Ukraine war, and Russia continue to sell its oil.
So how long do you think that can last for? Obviously, selling at a discount that steep isn't sustainable. How do you see that going into 2022?
Yeah, I'm not sure that Russia will be able to keep the current economic situation by the end of this year, because we have seen that Russia just will be able to sell gas and the oil with the oil and gas price cap. It's not will be easy to sell and to find the market. If one to sell to find the market, has to sell with the huge discount. And and referring to my Rachel initial remark about the current nuclear talk, and if I think it's not the first priority for the Biden administration after the last September and after the huge Iranian people protest in the street after the killing the Massa Amini. Biden administration and the EU stopped the nuclear talk, and they said that they're not priority for the continuing the JCPOA. But if the Biden and the West come to conclusion that to continue to start the new round of nuclear talk, and we see that maybe they're reviving up the JCPOA, but I'm not very optimistic about that. Iran will be get bit by market, but it's a reality that Iran at present in the market, Iran selling the oil in the correct market, in free market to the China with the huge discount. And according to Reuters, by the November and December, Iran exported more than 1 million barrels per day directly to the China, and also using the Malaysian facility when they're selling the oil with the name of the Malaysia. But Iran has to has a good competition with the Russian cheap oil. Russia has a good potential to sell oil to the India and China and Turkey, but Iran is under sanction, and it's not easy to find customers rather than China. And if nuclear will be ended by this year, and we have seen new JCPOA, Iran get back market take at least 2 or 3 years, and we have seen Iran oil in the market. Iran get back market has no short-term effect in the market. And referring to the main question, I think that they're putting himself and wants to put into continue war, or wants to have a new deal with the US over the Ukraine, or we have the peace war and the new peace between Ukraine and Russia. From the international relation perspective, it's beneficial for the Ukrainian war in first and for the rest of the world. But from the realistic and from the real politics, Russia is trying to gain more in the short term and maybe think about the long-term effect of the continuing the war.
I just want to touch on China. You briefly mentioned it, but bringing in Dr. Omar on that aspect. Obviously, you're seeing China-Middle East relations get closer and closer every year. It's kind of a prominent theme that's reoccurring. How do you see that playing out in 2023? And what do you think the U.S. perspective is of that, looking at that development occurring?
So I think the US, as mentioned by Rachel when she said that it's becoming more isolationist. So I completely concur with that. Problem is that when the US was being isolationist in the 19th century, there wasn't really the powers that it would compete and gain influence when it decreased influence were the British and the French, which were countries that didn't have empires that didn't have conflicting interests with the US. The problem is now, if the US decides to be isolationist and decrease its presence in the Middle East or anywhere else,
there's a void that can be filled.
There's a void that's going to be filled by adversary. It's not the British Empire or the French Empire, it's the Chinese Empire or the Chinese influence that takes its place. And this is creating a conundrum for the US, because what the US would like to do is when it withdraws, these countries to just either sort of agree to do what the US wants for a lower price, or just perhaps sort of disappear and not be of a nuisance in any sense. But the reality is that these countries, especially the Gulf states, have a critical security need that's become very apparent in the last 3 years, where we're seeing regular attacks on civilian infrastructure and oil infrastructure. And so they can't just be like, well, if the US doesn't want to, protect us, we'll just, go it alone, or we'll just, wing it. Now, the Chinese are not in the business of providing security guarantees, but at the very least, their investments and their integration into the local economies provides some measure of balance. And at the same time, they do realize, the Gulf states in particular, that China has influence over Iran. And seeing as most of the security threats that they face are associated with Iran, they at least perceive that if they have good relations with China, based on, for example, investments and so on and so forth, they could at least tell China to tell Iran to knock it off if Iran was, getting a little bit too shirty. So I think that's going to be what you're going to see is a continuation of this growth of Chinese influence in the region, primarily through the economic channels. This is going to create tension with this is going to not be to the taste of the US, but the US has to just realize that it can't have its cake and it can't be isolationist and make demands of what other countries do at the same time. The two is incongruent. And at the same time, the general state of insecurity.
Is the US truly being isolationist to the GCC, or is that kind of an overall?
I think what you see, if you take the high point as being the liberation of Kuwait in 1991, And then you compare that to in 2019, when there was the attack on the Bqiq in Eastern Province oil installations, and the US basically did nothing. I think it's difficult, although we all agree there's a lot of US troops in the region, it's difficult to contest the idea that the US's willingness to militarily defend its partner countries, whether we're talking about Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, is significantly diminished compared to some time like 1991. So I don't think it's gone full isolationist and it's just withdrawn everything. But I think it's quite clear that the sort of deterrent fear that it established in 1991 when it liberated Kuwait very quickly and very effectively is been eroded significantly, and in a way that reflects the reality of its willingness to be involved militarily in the region.
Rachel, I just want to shift gears, unless you want to make a follow-up
I wanted to come in and but
All right.
no, I know we're out of time.
No.
Ask your question. Ask your question, and I also may. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
I will say you're allowed to follow up to that comment, and then I'll ask my question and shift gears after that.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I mean, two things. One, when I was talking about an isolationist bent, I was thinking about that there is a significant chunk of both parties that are really looking inward. And that's a cycle. We've seen this at various points in the US trend. That doesn't mean across the board. And I recognize there are inconsistencies here. And one of the lessons from the coalition brought together to support Ukraine is been the difficulty of sort of amazing coordination among developed economies, but really big emerging markets, including the Gulf, really sort of waiting to see and having their own interests. I think Dr. Omar makes a really important point about sort of shift in U.S. military role in the region. That's true. It's not clear, though, to me that everyone in the region would like the sort of U.S. dominant role. They'd like it if it supported the interests of those regional actors. But I think it's a challenge. It's a challenging balancing act, and it's clear that the U.S. would like to be devoting less military, sort of forces around the world, including there. So again, the point being is things are shifting, and this is at a moment when I think that regional actors are really trying to step up economically. They're hedging, they're sort of trading in different ways. I think there are vacuums opening up. It's not clear to me that it becomes a one-for-one vacuum that people sort of take over. China, if anything, I think has been pretty unwilling to really step up and do military support in the other ways. I mean, China also hasn't been willing to really step up. So we'll watch to see. I think I'm really watching for what kind of technology transfer we're seeing across different, both defense and other supply chains. And this is a world where I think we really see different testing out of different groupings. But I'm conscious of time and conscious that you, Brian, wanted to take us in a maybe wrapping up direction.
Well, I just wanted to, of course, time goes by pretty quick on these panels, but I just wanted to, Rachel, as well, shift gears in the sense of the conversation of energy security, energy transition. You touched on it a little bit briefly in your previous comment. Obviously, with the Inflation Reduction Act, I think there's about almost $370 billion invested in climate-related funding. How do you see that playing out, impacting Biden's geopolitical energy strategy for 2023?
Well, I think if anything, it's a recognition that we need to be broadening our notion of what energy security means. So first of all, I think there's been a recognition in
We once had Amos Hochstein, of course, in a previous podcast, who was
wonderful
about
yeah
diversity of energy means energy security. So if we subscribe to that concept.
I do. I also think that you have to add a whole set of other geographies to your assessment of supply chains and the like. And I say this as somebody who cut my teeth sort of focused on sort of energy policy, economic policy, geopolitics of a lot of oil and gas rich countries and the big consumers, thinking about political questions of major producers of critical minerals and the battery supply chain and who is willing to bear that cost. So that doesn't mean that those issues that we started our conversation with become any less important. I just think that there's been a recognition that we need to sort of focus in on those security supply chains. The other issue is sort of broadening. So it's not clear to me that it's just that additional energy sources bring more stability. You have to sort of, manage them, and you also have to have storage, and you have to have other things that prepare for losses and outages, right? One of the things that made this summer a challenging time was not only questions about the Russian war, but also drought and impact on hydro in a number of key parts of the world that, if anything, made some of the shortages and reroutings even worse. So I think there's a whole number of issues sort of at play that we have to be thinking about when we're talking about energy security. And I will note that countries like China are very much keeping to their diversity of supply among the producing nations, also really continuing their all of the above energy approach. And so I think that's going to keep some of the longstanding competition underway. It might encourage a little more coordination in the short term. I think both the US and China are trying to dial down some of the rhetoric as they prepare for more competition. But I think ultimately we do have to be thinking a broader set of what's energy security, because otherwise we might face energy supply shocks, not only adding to political instability, but also exacerbating cyclical trends in the global economy.
We're running out of time and getting kind of notes from my producer, but I just want to give closing comments. Dr. Umud, if you could just give your 1 minute closing comments, outlook for the year ahead, and then we'll have Omar wrap it up for the session after that.
Yeah, sure. Energy crisis shows that all countries, no matter producer or consumer, has to revise their own energy policy according to new reality and new dynamics, and they have to focus on this at the same time energy security and energy transition. From the U.S. perspective, Biden administration has to invest in the energy infrastructure. I mean, renewable energy, electric vehicle, nuclear energy, hydrogen as well. And at the same time has to focus on the decarbonization of the new oil and gas field, and also more invest in carbon capture. And the other countries has to follow the same policy, and also just to more focus on diversification of energy resource, and more focus on domestic resource, no matter oil and gas, and also renewable. And from the oil and gas perspective, energy transition needs fossil fuel. Without the fossil fuel, we cannot be success in the energy transition process, in the climate change effect. I mean, all countries trying to decrease the effect of climate change to have a long-term net zero plan by China 2060, some GCC 2050, 2060, and US also. And I think more focus on energy transition and energy security, and also more invest in renewable, and also more invest in the new oil and gas field, with the aim of the processing oil and gas with the low carbon, and also carbon capture technology as well.
Dr. Omar, we'll wrap it up with you. Final closing comments. The year ahead for 2023 for the US.
Yeah, thanks. Just to say, I think the Gulf countries have an excellent opportunity if they wish to seize it. They are obviously oil producers and are enjoying the higher oil prices, and this gives them capital. They're also in a great position to lead, to be technological leaders in the development of the new renewable technologies and desalination technologies, and to connect their grid to the European grid, to the African grids. So there's many opportunities there. However, taking advantage of the opportunities is going to take some strategic thinking, and it's going to require the policy-making environment to elevate a notch or two, and for research to be really integrated into the way in which decisions are made at the highest level. If the GCC countries do that, then they have a very bright future, and they can have turned this sort of the threat that the climate change phenomenon posed to their economies into a wonderful opportunity to enter the middle of the 21st century as prosperous countries with a bright future.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Dr. Umud, Dr. Omar. We appreciate your insights as always. Thank you all for attending today's forum. We're wrapping up the 13th Global UAE Energy Forum. We appreciate it. Feel free to follow us at Gulf Intelligence for a recap of all the sessions today. We appreciate your time. Have a good evening.